Zoe Washington tapped her foot nervously on the worn courthouse floor. The hard wooden bench felt uncomfortable after sitting for almost 2 hours. She checked her watch again, 11:45 a.m. Her case was supposed to be called at 10 a.m. All around, her people waited with the same tired expressions, some scrolling through phones, others just staring blankly ahead. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to herself, adjusting her simple blue sweater. She had chosen casual clothes today, jeans, sweater, and her favorite sneakers. It was supposed to be her day off, a rare break from the intense schedule she kept at the White House. Now here she was, fighting a traffic ticket she never deserved. The door to the courtroom opened, and a court officer called out several names. Zoe's was among them. Finally. She gathered her papers and walked into courtroom 3B. Judge Harold Green sat tall behind his bench, looking down with an expression that suggested he had already heard every excuse in the book. His gray hair and stern face gave him an air of authority that seemed to fill the room. Case number 47293, Washington versus District of Columbia, the clerk announced in a bored voice. Zoe stepped forward to the defendant's table, standing straight despite her modest height of 5'4". On the other side of the room, officers Frank Miller and Peter Donovan stood in their crisp blue uniforms, looking confident and relaxed. "Your Honor, I'm here to contest this traffic violation," Zoe began, her voice clear and steady despite her nerves. "The ticket states I ran a red light at the corner of 14th and F Street on April 10th, but I know for certain the light was yellow when I entered the intersection." Judge Green barely looked up from his papers. "Officers, your statement?" Officer Miller stepped forward. He was tall with broad shoulders and a face that looked like it rarely smiled. "Your Honor, I clearly observed Ms. Washington's vehicle entering the intersection approximately 3 seconds after the light turned red. When I pulled her over, she was argumentative and insisted she had done nothing wrong." "I wasn't argumentative," Zoe cut in. "I was simply explaining my position." Officer Donovan, shorter than his partner but with the same stern expression, added, "The defendant claims she was in a rush and couldn't be late. We deal with these excuses all day long." "I never said that," Zoe said firmly. "I told you I was certain the light was yellow, and I asked if there was camera footage we could check." Officer Miller smirked. "Little lady, we don't need camera footage when we witnessed the violation ourselves." Zoe felt her cheeks grow warm at the patronizing tone. "Little lady, I have a name, Officer Miller, and I have a right to question evidence presented against me." Judge Green sighed heavily. "Ms. Washington, the officers are trained professionals. They gain nothing from writing false tickets. Do you have any actual evidence beyond your word against theirs?" Zoe opened her folder. "Yes, Your Honor. I have a time-stamped receipt from the coffee shop on that corner. I was inside until 8:43 a.m., and the ticket shows I was pulled over at 8:45 a.m. The shop is on the same side of the street as the direction I was traveling, which means I would have needed to wait for the light to change before proceeding through the intersection. The timing makes it highly unlikely I would have hit a red light." Officer Donovan rolled his eyes. "Those shop clocks aren't exactly synchronized with atomic time, Your Honor." "Neither are police watches," Zoe replied evenly. "And I'd like to point out that the body cam footage would settle this question immediately." Judge Green frowned. "Officers, do you have the body cam footage available?" The officers exchanged glances. "There was an equipment malfunction that day," Officer Miller said smoothly. "But our testimony should be sufficient." Zoe took a deep breath. This was exactly the kind of thing she had been working to address in her policy recommendations. As senior advisor for criminal justice reform to the president, she had spent months researching how equipment malfunctions conveniently occurred when evidence might contradict official accounts. But today, she wasn't here as an advisor. She was here as Zoe Washington, citizen. "Your Honor, without evidence beyond the officer's word against mine, I believe the burden of proof hasn't been met. I respectfully request this case be dismissed." Judge Green leaned forward, peering at her over his reading glasses. "Ms. Washington, perhaps things work differently wherever you're from, but here we respect the testimony of our officers. They put their lives on the line every day to keep our streets safe." "I'm from here, Your Honor." Born and raised in D.C., Zoe said quietly. And I have the highest respect for law enforcement. What I don't respect is being talked down to or having my rights ignored. Officer Miller stepped closer to the bench. Your Honor, we see this all the time. Young people who think the rules don't apply to them, always on their phones, not paying attention to traffic signals, then wanting to argue about it. I wasn't on my phone, Zoe said firmly. And I'm not arguing. I'm exercising my right to contest. A ticket, I believe, was issued in error. Judge Green waved his hand dismissively. The fine is $150. Pay it on your way out or file an appeal if you must, but I'm not dismissing the officer's clear testimony based on a coffee shop receipt. Zoe stood still for a moment, considering her options. She could reveal who she was, make a phone call that would likely make this problem go away. Senator Lily Garcia would be more than happy to put in a word, or she could ask Calvin Boyd, the White House Chief of Staff, to make a call. But that wasn't the point. I'll pay the fine today, Your Honor, but I would like the record to show my objection to how this case was handled. Noted, Judge Green said without looking up, already shuffling papers for the next case. Next. Officer. Miller gave her a small, satisfied smile as she turned to leave. Maybe next time you'll pay more attention to the traffic signals, Ms. Washington. Zoe nodded politely, but said nothing as she collected her things. As she walked through the courtroom doors, she pulled out her phone and made a quick note in her digital recorder. Personal experience case TAR 47293, Judge Harold Green, Officers Frank Miller and Peter Donovan. Clear example of dismissive treatment, lack of body cam accountability, and judicial bias against young black defendants. Add to policy brief for next week's meeting with the president. She put her phone away and headed toward the payment window. In 3 weeks, she would be leading a major White House initiative on police reform and judicial accountability. Officer Miller, Officer Donovan, and Judge Green had no idea they had just provided her with a perfect case study. Zoe almost smiled as she pulled out her credit card. Sometimes being underestimated had its advantages. Officers Frank Miller and Peter Donovan walked up the steps of the White House with a mix of pride and nervousness. 3 weeks had passed since the traffic court case with that stubborn young woman. Today was much more important. They had been selected to join a special task force on community policing initiatives. A letter with the presidential seal had arrived at their precinct last week, naming them specifically. Can you believe this? Officer Donovan whispered as they passed through security. His hands shook slightly as he handed over his badge and ID. I mean, the White House. My mom nearly fainted when I told her. Officer Miller nodded, trying to look calm though his heart raced. Just remember, we represent the whole department. Chief says this could mean additional funding if we make a good impression. A young aide met them in the lobby. Officers Miller and Donovan, welcome to the White House. I'm Kyle. The meeting is about to begin in the Roosevelt Room. Please follow me. They walked through hallways lined with historical paintings and photographs. Important-looking people hurried past with folders and tablets. Kyle led them to a conference room where about 15 people were already seated around a large table. Please, take these seats here, Kyle said, pointing to 2 empty chairs. The meeting will begin any moment. Officer Miller glanced around the table. There were other police officers from different cities, people in expensive suits who looked like lawyers or politicians, and several people typing on laptops who might be staff members. Everyone looked important. The door opened again, and several more people entered. First came a tall woman with silver hair who Officer Miller recognized as Victoria Bennett, the president's chief of staff. Behind her were 2 cabinet secretaries he had seen on television. They were followed by a group of advisors carrying folders and tablets. The last person to enter was a young black woman in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit. She carried herself with complete confidence as she moved to the head of the table. Something about her seemed familiar, but Officer Miller couldn't place her. Victoria Bennett spoke first. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this important discussion on police reform and community relations. Before we begin, I want to introduce our meeting chair, Zoe Washington, Senior Advisor to the President on Criminal Justice Reform, and the architect of the Community First Policing Initiative that brings us together today. Officer Donovan nudged Miller with his elbow. Hey, doesn't that name sound familiar? Miller frowned, looking more closely at the young woman. As she began speaking, a cold feeling spread through his chest. That voice. He knew that voice. Thank you all for being here, Zoe said, her clear voice commanding the room's attention. As many of you know, the President has made police reform a key priority of this administration. We believe that effective policing begins with respect, accountability, and community partnership. She clicked a button, and a presentation appeared on the large screen behind her. The first slide read, From personal experience to policy change, real-world examples of systemic bias. Before we dive into the specific proposals, Zoe continued, I'd like to share how personal experiences often highlight the need for institutional change. 3 weeks ago, I had a revealing experience in traffic court that perfectly illustrates why this work matters. Officer Miller felt his face grow hot. Next to him, Officer Donovan had gone completely still. Zoe clicked to the next slide, which showed a timeline of events from a traffic stop. There were no names or photos, just the facts laid out clearly. In this case, we see several concerning patterns, she explained. First, the dismissal of citizen evidence. Second, the convenient equipment malfunction excuse when body cam footage was requested. Third, the use of patronizing language like little lady to undermine the citizen's credibility. She looked up and her eyes met Officer Miller's. There was no anger there, just calm determination. I was that citizen, she said simply, and while I could have used my position to make that ticket disappear, I chose instead to experience our justice system as millions of Americans do every day. What I found was troubling, but not surprising. The room had gone completely silent. Officer Miller felt like everyone was staring at him, though most people in the room had no idea of his connection to the story. Zoe continued. Now, I'm not sharing this to embarrass anyone. In fact, I believe the officers involved could offer valuable perspective to our task force. That's why I specifically invited Officers Frank Miller and Peter Donovan to join us today. Every head in the room turned toward them. Victoria Bennett raised an eyebrow. One of the cabinet secretaries gave them a look that made Officer Miller want to disappear under the table. Zoe smiled. Officers, I believe your frontline experience, combined with a willingness to examine and improve practices, could be incredibly valuable to this initiative. Would you be willing to share your perspective on how we might better bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they serve? Officer Miller's mouth felt dry. He cleared his throat. Ms. Washington, we. Officer Donovan jumped in. We clearly have a lot to learn, and we appreciate the opportunity to contribute despite our previous interaction. Zoe nodded. Excellent, because this isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about recognizing patterns that need to change and working together to change them. She turned back to the whole group. The President believes, as I do, that most officers enter this profession with good intentions. Our job is to ensure that systems and training support those good intentions rather than undermine them. For the next hour, Zoe led the discussion with impressive knowledge and skill. She knew statistics, legal precedents, and policy details that Officer Miller could barely follow. Cabinet members and senior officials deferred to her expertise. Even Victoria Bennett took notes when she spoke. As the meeting ended, Zoe approached the officers directly. Officers Miller and Donovan, if you're willing, I'd like you to join a smaller working group that will meet weekly to develop specific training protocols. Your perspective would be valuable. Officer Miller swallowed hard. Ms. Washington, I owe you an apology. The way I spoke to you in that courtroom was unprofessional and disrespectful. Zoe smiled slightly. Yes, it was. But now you have a chance to help make sure it doesn't happen to others. I'd rather have your help than your apology. You have it, Officer Donovan said quickly. Both the help and the apology. As they left the White House, walking down the same steps they had climbed earlier with such pride, their mood was completely different. I can't believe she's the one behind the new reform bill, Officer Miller said quietly. And we treated her like... Officer Donovan shook his head. Like we treat too many people. You know that's the point she was making, right? It shouldn't matter who she is. We should treat everyone with the same respect. Officer Miller nodded slowly, thinking about all the traffic stops, all the court appearances, all the times he had used that same dismissive tone without thinking twice about it. I guess we're going to be seeing a lot more of Ms. Washington, he said. And learning a lot from her too, Officer Donovan added. If we're smart. Judge Harold Green sat in his office staring at the formal letter that had arrived that morning. The heavy cream paper with the White House seal made his hands sweat slightly as he read it again. He had been invited to join a special judicial review panel examining courtroom bias and procedural fairness. The invitation came directly from the White House Office of Legal Policy. This makes no sense, he muttered to himself. Why me? I've been on the bench for 20 years without anyone questioning my methods. His clerk knocked on the open door. Judge Green, your 3 o'clock appointment is here. Send them in, he said, quickly tucking the letter into his desk drawer. A young man in a dark suit entered. Judge Green, I'm Eric Taylor from the White House Office of Legal Policy. I'm here to discuss the Judicial Review Panel invitation. Judge, Green shook his hand. Yes, I received it this morning. I have to say I'm surprised. My record speaks for itself. Eric smiled politely. That's exactly why you were selected, sir. Your extensive case history provides an excellent data set for our analysis. The first meeting is next Tuesday at 9 a.m. A car will pick you up at 8:15. Wait, I haven't agreed to. The Chief Justice has already approved the participation of all selected judges, Eric said smoothly. He believes this initiative will strengthen public trust in our courts. We'll see you Tuesday. With a polite nod, Eric left as quickly as he had arrived. The following Tuesday, Judge Green found himself walking into a White House conference room. 5 other judges were already seated, along with several people in professional attire who were setting up laptops and distributing folders. Harold, good to see you, called Judge Patricia Rivera from the Ninth Circuit. Can you believe we were selected for this? Before he could answer, the door opened and several White House officials entered. Judge Green recognized Victoria Bennett, the Chief of Staff. Behind her walked a young black woman who looked vaguely familiar. Victoria Bennett addressed the room. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this important initiative. I'd like to introduce Zoe Washington, Senior Advisor to the President on Criminal Justice Reform, who will be leading this panel. Zoe stepped forward. Thank you all for being here. This panel has been created to examine patterns of bias in our courtrooms and develop practical guidelines to ensure equal treatment for all Americans in our justice system. Judge Green frowned. Where did he know her from? As she continued speaking, showing slides with statistics about sentencing disparities and procedural irregularities, it suddenly hit him. The traffic court case a few weeks ago, the young woman, who had questioned the officer's testimony. His face grew warm as Zoe clicked to a new slide. We've analyzed case records from each of your courtrooms over the past 5 years, looking at patterns in how different demographic groups are treated. Judge Green shifted uncomfortably in his seat as she continued. For example, in cases involving contested traffic violations where it's the citizen's word against an officer's, Judge Green rules in favor of the officer 97% of the time. However, there's a notable disparity. When the defendant is a white male over 40, that percentage drops to 76%. For black women under 30, it rises to 99.4%. All eyes in the room turned toward Judge Green. He cleared his throat. Those numbers can't be right. I follow the law, not demographics. Zoe smiled politely. The data was compiled by an independent team of statisticians. Every case was coded and analyzed blind, without names attached. The patterns emerged quite clearly. She directed everyone's attention to the folders in front of them. You'll each find your own statistics here, along with comparative data. This isn't about individual blame, but recognizing patterns we all fall into unconsciously. Judge Rivera spoke up. Ms. Washington, I appreciate the research, but surely there are other factors at play. Perhaps younger people are actually more likely to commit violations and less convincing in court. An excellent point, Zoe replied. which is why we also analyzed body camera footage from a sample of these cases where available. In 82% of cases involving young black defendants, the court interaction included at least one instance of what our behavioral analysts classified as dismissive language from the bench. For older white defendants, that figure was 14%. Judge Green remembered exactly how he had spoken to Zoe in his courtroom. He had barely looked at her, had dismissed her evidence without proper consideration, had sided with the officers automatically. As the meeting continued, Zoe outlined the 6-month review process. Each judge would participate in workshops on implicit bias, review anonymized transcripts from their own courtrooms, and help develop new procedural guidelines to ensure fair treatment. This isn't about pointing fingers, Zoe explained. It's about recognizing patterns that affect justice. We all have biases. The problem comes when we deny them instead of addressing them. After the meeting, Judge Green approached Zoe as she gathered her materials. "Ms. Washington, I believe we've met before, in my courtroom." She looked up. "Yes, Judge Green. About a month ago. I owe you an apology. My treatment of your case was less than professional." Zoe regarded him steadily. "It wasn't just my case, Judge Green, that's the point. My case was just one of thousands where similar patterns appear. So this is about revenge? Making an example of me because I ruled against you?" Zoe shook her head. "This initiative was planned months before our interaction. Your courtroom was selected based on statistical analysis, not personal history. But I won't pretend our encounter didn't confirm what the data already showed." Judge Green frowned. "So what happens now? Am I supposed to rule in favor of everyone who questions an officer's testimony?" "Not at all," Zoe replied. "You're supposed to give each person the same fair consideration regardless of their age, race, or appearance. Evidence should be evaluated on merit, not on who presents it." She picked up her tablet. "Next week's session includes body camera footage from the officers in my case. Turns out there was no equipment malfunction after all. The footage clearly shows the light was yellow when I entered the intersection." Judge Green's face reddened. "I see. This isn't about my traffic ticket, Judge Green. It's about making sure everyone gets the same careful consideration in your courtroom that you'd want if you were standing where I stood." As Judge Green left the White House, he felt a mix of embarrassment and defensiveness. For 20 years, he had prided himself on being fair and impartial. The idea that his decisions might show patterns of bias disturbed him deeply. Back in his chambers that afternoon, he pulled up the case files for the day. His first hearing was another traffic violation case. The defendant was a young Hispanic woman contesting a speeding ticket. Judge Green paused, thinking about how he would typically handle such a case. For the first time, he found himself questioning his own assumptions. Would he give this woman's testimony the same weight as the officers? Would he listen as carefully to her as he would to someone who reminded him of himself? With a sigh, Judge Green closed the file. Perhaps this review panel would be more valuable than he had initially thought. Officer Frank Miller sat in the back row of the training room, watching as Zoe Washington led the workshop on community engagement. It had been 3 months since that first shocking meeting at the White House. Since then, he and Officer Donovan had attended weekly sessions as part of the Police Reform Working Group. Today's session focused on how officers could build trust in neighborhoods where relations with police had historically been tense. Zoe moved around the room with energy and purpose, directing role-playing exercises and facilitating discussions between officers and community members who had been invited to participate. "Remember," she said to the group, "trust goes both ways. When officers approach citizens with respect and openness, they're much more likely to receive cooperation in return." Officer Miller found himself nodding. 3 months ago, he would have rolled his eyes at such a statement, dismissing it as naive. Now, he had seen the evidence and heard enough stories to know better. After the session ended, Zoe approached him. "Officer Miller, do you have a moment?" He nodded, still somewhat nervous around her despite the weeks of working together. "Of course, Ms. Washington." "I've been impressed with your participation these past weeks," she said. "You've been actively engaged in every session, and several community members have commented on your thoughtful questions." "Thank you," he said, surprised by the praise. I've been learning a lot. I have a request, Zoe continued. We're organizing a special youth forum next week at Franklin High School. Would you be willing to participate? We need officers who can speak honestly about the challenges of policing, while also showing students that they're willing to listen and learn. Officer Miller hesitated. I'm not sure I'm the right person. My own teenage daughter barely speaks. To me these days, I'm not great with young people. Zoe smiled. That's exactly why I'm asking you. This isn't about officers who already have perfect relationships with youth. It's about creating bridges where there are gaps. Officer Miller thought about his 16-year-old daughter Amber. They had once been close, but in recent years, the distance between them had grown. Their conversations had become strained, filled with his lectures and her eye rolls. It wasn't so different from how he often interacted with young people on the job. I'll do it, he said finally. But I might need some coaching. That's what we're all about, Zoe replied with a smile. The following week, Officer Miller found himself sitting in a circle with 20 high school students. The session started awkwardly, with the teens eyeing the police officers with suspicion. Before we begin, Zoe said to the group, I want everyone to understand that this is a safe space for honest conversation. Nothing said here will result in any kind of punishment or record. We're here to listen and learn from each other. A young black girl with braids raised her hand. I have a question. Why do police officers always assume we're up to something bad? Last week, my friends and I were just sitting in the park and an officer came over and started questioning us like we were criminals. Officer Miller felt his defensive instincts kick in. In the past, he would have immediately explained why the officer was justified. Instead, he remembered the training from recent weeks. That's a fair question, he said, and I'm sorry that happened to you. The honest truth is that sometimes we're trained to look for problems, and that can lead us to see threats where there aren't any. It's something I'm working on changing in myself. The girl looked surprised by his answer. For real? I thought you'd just make excuses. 3 months ago, I probably would have, Officer Miller admitted. But I'm learning that I can't be an effective officer if the community doesn't trust me, and trust has to be earned. As the session continued, Officer Miller found himself sharing more honestly than he ever had before about the challenges and fears that came with his job. In turn, the students opened up about their experiences and perceptions of police. After the forum ended, Officer Miller found Zoe waiting for him in the hallway. That went well, she said, especially your exchange with Keisha about the park incident. It felt different, he admitted. Usually in these community meetings, I feel like I have to defend the entire police department. Today I was just trying to listen and be honest. That's exactly the point, Zoe said. Real change happens one conversation at a time. As Officer Miller drove home that evening, he thought about his daughter Amber. Their relationship had become increasingly strained. Over the past year, he realized with a jolt that he often spoke to her the same way he had spoken to Zoe in that courtroom. Dismissive, not really listening, assuming he knew better. When he arrived home, Amber was in the kitchen making a sandwich. Hey, he said, trying a different approach than his usual, where have you been? Or, have you done your homework? Hey, she replied cautiously. I had an interesting day today, he said. I participated in a forum with some high school students about police-community relations. Amber looked surprised. This wasn't their usual conversation. How'd that go? It made me think about some things, he said, including how I talk to you sometimes. I think maybe I don't listen as well as I could. Amber put down her sandwich, looking at him with confusion. Are you feeling okay, Dad? He laughed. Yeah, I'm fine. Just learning some new things at work. Actually, there's this advisor to the president who's been running these training sessions for us. She's pretty amazing. Younger than most of the people she's training, but brilliant. What's her name? Amber asked, seeming genuinely interested. Zoe Washington. She's working on this big police reform bill. But the funny thing is, before I knew who she was, I treated her pretty badly during a traffic stop. Dad, that's so embarrassing, Amber said. But she was smiling now, engaged in the conversation. Tell me about it, Officer Miller said, shaking his head. But instead of getting me fired, she invited me to help work on making things better. That's cool, Amber said. Then, after a pause, I have a debate tournament this weekend. If you're not working, maybe you could come? Officer Miller felt something warm spread through his chest. I'd like that, and I promise to just listen and not try to tell your debate team how to do their job. For the first time in months, they both laughed together. Across town, Zoe was meeting with Judge Green, reviewing the progress of the Judicial Review Panel. The judge had been resistant at first, but over the weeks he had begun to engage more sincerely with the process. I've been reviewing my case notes from the past month, Judge Green said, and tracking my decisions more carefully. I have to admit, I've noticed some patterns in my own thinking that I wasn't aware of before. That's the most important first step, Zoe replied. We all have biases. The problem isn't having them. It's denying them and allowing them to affect our decisions without examination. Judge Green nodded. I used to pride myself on being consistent. Now I realize that what I thought was consistency might actually have been rigidity. Change isn't easy, Zoe said, especially when you've been doing things a certain way for a long time. But it's worth it. As she gathered her papers to leave, Judge Green asked, May I ask you something personal, Ms. Washington? After how I treated you in my courtroom, do you maintain such a professional attitude working with me now? Zoe smiled. Because this was never about me, Judge Green. It was always about building a better system for everyone. Personal feelings can't get in the way of that goal. 1 year had passed since that day in traffic court. Zoe Washington stood in the East Room of the White House, watching as people filed in for the signing ceremony. The Community Justice and Policing Reform Act was about to become law after months of hard work, negotiations, and small victories adding up to major change. President Alan Marsh would arrive soon to sign the bill, surrounded by lawmakers, community leaders, and law enforcement officials who had helped shape the legislation. Zoe felt a mix of pride and exhaustion. This bill had been her focus for the past 18 months. Ms. Washington? A familiar voice called. She turned to see Officers Frank Miller and Peter Donovan approaching, both looking uncomfortable in formal suits instead of their usual uniforms. Officers, she greeted them with a genuine smile. Thank you for coming today. We wouldn't miss it, Officer Donovan said. After all the sessions and feedback and role-playing exercises, we deserve to see the final product. Officer Miller nodded. Plus, my daughter Amber would never forgive me if I skipped out on a White House ceremony. She's been telling everyone at school that her dad helped write a bill for the president. Zoe laughed. And she's right. Both of you contributed important perspectives that shaped this legislation. Over the past year, Officers Miller and Donovan had become valuable members of the working group. Their initial defensiveness had gradually given way to honest engagement. They had challenged some proposals, improved others, and helped ensure the final bill included practical measures that officers on the street could actually implement. Across the room, Zoe spotted Judge Harold Green, speaking with several other judges who had participated in the Judicial Review Panel. The panel had produced a comprehensive set of guidelines for reducing bias in courtrooms, many of which had been incorporated into the bill. Victoria Bennett, the President's Chief of Staff, approached Zoe. The President will be here in 5 minutes. Are you ready for your introduction? Zoe took a deep breath. Yes, I'm ready. Victoria squeezed her shoulder. You've done remarkable work, Zoe. This bill wouldn't exist without you. A few minutes later, everyone took their seats as the President entered. After a brief welcome, he invited Zoe to the podium. Thank you, Mr. President, Zoe began, looking out at the assembled guests. 1 year ago, this legislation began not with grand theories, but with real experiences. It began in a traffic court, where a routine interaction revealed patterns that needed changing. It began with officers who were willing to reconsider their approaches, and judges who were brave enough to examine their own biases. She made eye contact with Officer Miller and Judge Green as she continued. This bill isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about recognizing that systems can be improved, that better training leads to better outcomes, and that True public safety depends on mutual respect between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Zoe outlined the key provisions of the bill: new training requirements, accountability measures, community oversight boards, and judicial guidelines designed to ensure equal treatment under the law. But laws alone don't create change, she said. In closing, change happens one interaction at a time, one officer, one judge, one citizen choosing to do things differently. I've witnessed that change firsthand over this past year, and it gives me hope for what we can accomplish together. As she returned to her seat, the room filled with applause. President Marsh took the podium to make his remarks before signing the bill into law. After the ceremony, a reception was held in the state dining room. Zoe found herself surrounded by well-wishers and congratulations. As the crowd thinned, Judge Green approached her. "Ms. Washington, I wanted to thank you personally," he said. "This process hasn't been easy for me. 20 years on the bench, and I had to confront some uncomfortable truths about how I've handled cases. But my courtroom is better for it." "I appreciate your willingness to engage with the process, Judge Green," Zoe replied. "Many in your position would have resisted change." "I almost did," he admitted. "But the evidence was too clear to ignore. Last week, a young man in my court reminded me of how far I've come. Last year, I would have dismissed his testimony without a second thought. This time I listened. It turned out he was telling the truth." Officers Miller and Donovan joined them, each holding a small plate of food from the reception. "We were just talking about changes we've seen," Judge Green explained to them. Officer Miller nodded. "My captain says civilian complaints in our precinct are down 30% since we implemented the new training approaches. And here's the surprise. Arrests for serious crimes are actually up. Turns out people are more willing to help us solve cases when they don't see us as the enemy. That's exactly the kind of outcome we were hoping for," Zoe said. "Better policing, not less policing." Officer Donovan smiled. "Miller here has become quite the advocate. He's been volunteering for extra community engagement shifts at the high school." Officer Miller looked slightly embarrassed. "My daughter volunteers there too. It's given us something to talk about. Actually, she's thinking about law school now." "The world could use more good lawyers," Zoe said with a smile. As the reception wound down, Zoe stepped out into the rose garden for a moment of quiet. Victoria Bennett joined her there. "The president has an announcement he wanted me to discuss with you first," Victoria said. "He's planning to nominate you for Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights." Zoe's eyes widened. "That's a big step up." "And well-deserved," Victoria replied. "Your work on this bill has been exceptional. The president believes you're ready for a larger role in shaping justice policy." "I'm honored," Zoe said, "and a little overwhelmed." "There's one more thing," Victoria continued. "The nomination will require Senate confirmation hearings. The president wanted to make sure you're prepared for the public scrutiny that will bring." Zoe nodded, thinking about how far she had come from that day in traffic court. "I'm ready." 2 weeks later, Zoe sat in a Senate hearing room, preparing to answer questions about her qualifications for the Assistant Attorney General position. As she arranged her notes, she noticed Officer Frank Miller and Judge Harold Green entering the room. They gave her encouraging nods as they took seats in the back. Several other members of the working groups and panels had come to show support. Their presence reminded Zoe that the most important changes weren't the laws or policies they had created, but the relationships they had built and the minds they had opened, including her own. When the committee chairman called the hearing to order, Zoe sat straight in her chair, ready for whatever questions would come. She had learned that real change didn't happen through confrontation alone, but through persistence, evidence, and a willingness to see the humanity in everyone, even those who had underestimated or dismissed her. As she began her opening statement, she caught Officer Miller's eye. He gave her a small thumbs up. They had come a long way from little lady in traffic court to this moment of mutual respect. That journey, more than any bill or nomination, was the true measure of success.